Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 8th of December, where we are talking about The Exorcist. You'll remember I had talked about that I was unable to find a free version online, though certainly you can rent versions online if you so wanted to, and that the film is just as graphic as the text, so I'm not necessarily sure that you would even want to watch a version. However, the film is very close to the actual text itself because the author, William Peter Blatty, worked on both. And if you're having difficulty with reading some of those graphic passages, what I suggest you do is that you just skim through them. And again, I was indicating that I believe that the graphicness of the novel has led it to be misread and misunderstood, and the same with the film. And that if we look at the title, the focus is not on the possessed girl, Regan McNeil, the focus is on the exorcist. So if we were to read the text from that perspective, I think what we have is a much more engaging text. That said, I'm the first to admit that this text might not necessarily have as much literary smoothness as some of the other texts that we've read, but I think in terms of plot, especially in terms of it serving as a kind of cultural phenomenon, that it definitely deserves a place in our list of major Gothic texts. The first horror film actually to be nominated for Best Picture. It had 10 Academy Award nominations. It won for Sound, Best Adapted Screenplay. And the reviews included talking about this text as a supernatural mystery story. And of course, we've talked about how Edgar Allan Poe has been credited with creating the first mystery story, so that seems to be very appropriate. One of the things I'm going to do next class is talk about quotes, but you'll notice that the opening quotes include biblical evil as well as human evil, and there is a parallel between the two that's made in this particular text. Our prologue is in Iraq, and I believe, as I had mentioned previously, that's reputedly the site of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. And we see that our first exorcist, or who will be our first exorcist, Father Marin, is a kind of premonition that something is going to be going wrong. And Marin, much like the Van Helsing figure that we've examined before in Dracula, is able to merge science, he's an archaeologist, along with religion. He happens to be a Jesuit priest, and that a Jesuit is for the Society of Jesus. We'll see that Father Karras is able to do the same by merging psychology as well as ultimately religion. And we are, in the very beginning, introduced to what would seem to be that which is abnormal, or that which brings forth disgust. An individual who happens to have rotting teeth occurred. And one of the premises of this text that we see early on is that it's important to learn to love the base and the bestial. Not necessarily to feel love, but to act with love, as we're told later on in the text. We're also introduced to Pazuzu, who happens to be a demon that's associated with sickness and disease in the Southwest, which helps to lend our supernatural element to the text. And the sunset that occurs is in the Southwest. And as we know, things like sunsets and nighttime can represent descent. So again, the opening is very much establishing, foreshadowing much of what we are going to be experiencing in the text proper. When we're introduced to the first book, so to speak, in the first chapter, we're told that the house is gripped by ivy. And, this idea of claustrophobia, I think, is something that we've seen certainly in the Gothic. The events occur on April 1st. You could perhaps say that the devil has a sense of humor, especially as the text progresses, and we see that. And it occurs in Washington, D.C. and Georgetown. I've oftentimes argued that that's the modern seat of evil. If Iraq is the biblical seat of evil, what is comparable in the United States is Washington, D.C. We see definitely this idea of generation gap. Remember, it's the 1970s, so this was one of the major anxieties and struggles of the time period, that adults could not understand this youth culture that would seem to be almost, if you will, possessed once they were under the influence of drugs. We're introduced to Chris, who is an atheist and divorced and a wealthy actor. Sharon, who happens to be her assistant, which again shows part of Chris's wealth, but she also is engaged in transcendental meditation. The concern at the time is that perhaps could open up gateways to other dimensions. And we're introduced to Dennings, the director, and he has his struggles with alcohol. And I would argue that all of these characters have their own demons, whether they be literal or figurative, that they're struggling with. And of course, we're introduced to Reagan, who's at 11 years old. She's right on the cusp of adolescence. And we see that she's having some difficulties with math, with missing clothes, with moved furniture. She's using a Ouija board by herself. And according to Ouija board folklore, that should never occur because of the danger of some sort of spirit entity being able to control one individual. If there's two, there's supposed to be more balance. So again, we could just see a disturbed young girl who is kept isolated basically from her peers. Notice that she basically is continually interacting with adults. And this is a girl that's struggling with her divorce again, or with the divorce of her parents. Again, divorce would have been seen as a somewhat unusual social phenomenon in the 1970s. Much, much, much less so today. In fact, it's quite commonplace. Or we could perhaps see a girl that is an open vessel for a supernatural entity to possess. In chapter 2, we're introduced to Father Karras, who happened to be a boxer in his youth, and one might argue that that helps prepare him for the fight of his life, if you will, with the demon that will be occurring. And he has lost his faith. He wants a sign from God. And we can view this in two ways. This is the sign that God is providing. Or we can also see Karras as a particularly delicious individual for a devil to inhabit and to, at least in one way or another, to try to have a fall occur, because we've got a priest who's struggling with his faith. Again, we're introduced to a derelict when Karras is on his way to visit his mother about how to love the bass. It's something that he struggles with. Notice how Karras gives his money that he had saved for a cab when he's traveling to visit his mother to that derelict. The idea of sacrifice, which is something that we see that these priests will engage in, and it's part of the Christian mythos of Jesus sacrificing. And then we're introduced to Karras's mom, who's lonely and a poor woman, who's living in a very questionable neighborhood in New York City. Again, her lifestyle is very much in contrast to Karras's lifestyle, who we could say lives a kind of life of privilege now that he's in the priesthood. But compared to some of the upper administrators in the Catholic Church, Karras is rather poor. So I think we see this stratification of social hierarchy in this particular text. And the day after Reagan's 12th birthday, which puts her right in adolescence, is when some of the supernatural phenomenon, or the seeming supernatural phenomenon, which could also be poltergeist phenomenon, occur, with personality changes, lying, insomnia, whether this is physiological, psychological, supernatural, or perhaps a combination of all three. In chapter 4, we're introduced to the idea of what a black mass is and some desecrations that are going on into the church. Note that Reagan lives right next door to her church, so there always is the possibility that she herself could have been involved in these desecrations. We find out about Karras's mother, who dies basically alone, and this is going to haunt Karras. This will be his major demon over the course of the text. It's also when we're introduced to a Mrs. Perrin, who happens to be a seer, and Reagan won't talk to this particular person nor shake her hands. Again, that leads to the question of, is there some sort of supernatural phenomenon going on that the Reagan character does not necessarily want others, such as seers, to be able to perceive at this point? We're also told about the occult and about seances, because basically the author is aware that, much like Shirley Jackson was, there's going to need to be a little bit of instruction about the supernatural that goes on within the text. Probably one of the reasons why Reagan is such a horrific creature is because of the loss of control of bodily functions that occur initially in the early stages of the text, but then we see very much increased over the course of the text itself. And then we're introduced to the second book, if you will, where we're given another opening quote that wisdom occurs through the awful grace of God. And that helps to set the foundation of the awful, but also the grace associated with spirituality, God in particular. We're known that Karis's mother is taken to an insane asylum before she is basically before she dies. And we also learn about the loneliness of priests. In chapter 2, we see the deterioration of Regan, and the book on devil worship disappears, again leading to questions of, is it possible that Regan could have read this and in one way or another internalized it? Chapter 3, we're told that Regan is speaking backwards, which is kind of interesting because, at least according to the lore associated with possession, an individual can speak in other tongues. And again, this is another piece of ambiguity. Could we even qualify English backwards as another tongue? We see her speaking in other voices with body contortions, lots of references to sexuality, which again would have shocked the audience coming from such a young female, especially presented in such an innocent way at the beginning of the text. Animal noises to reinforce the bestial. In fact, one of the subliminal techniques that was used by the film director was to use some audio of pigs at slaughter underneath much of the devil voices to, again, lead to a sense of disorientation and discomfort for the audience, which might perhaps explain why audiences reacted so viscerally to this particular film. Burke is killed. He falls down that flight of stairs, which actually is a real flight of stairs in Washington, D.C. It's become quite the tourist attraction. And of course, the question is, who has killed Burke? That's part of the mystery that we need to solve. When Regan is hypnotized, Regan talks about the idea of wanting to punish herself and that she hates herself in what would seem to be the voice of a demon. And this is when we're introduced to a homicide detective, William Kinderman. Notice his last name, Kinderman, or kind man, which is exactly what he is. As he's lamenting how youth culture is filled with drug use and abuse, LSD in youth. Again, sort of establishing that idea of the culture itself being possessed in one way or another. Chris is hoping to have another movie because she needs it financially, at least in order to be able to travel and live the lifestyle in which she has become accustomed. The movie that she loses is called Hope. And this is, of course, very telling. It's very symbolic that she herself is losing hope. And in fact, perhaps she's already lost hope in the sense that she doesn't have any religious affinity, because basically this is a text, much like we saw in Dracula, that establishes Christianity as savior. We're also introduced to the character of Carl Engstrom, who happens to be one of Chris's servants. And this is particularly important because this isn't explored very much in depth in the film, but in the text we see how he's an ex-felon. In fact, he was involved in a drug theft, and what Detective Kinderman is able to uncover is that Carl has been stealing drugs for his drug-addicted daughter. Again, that embedded commentary about drug use and abuse during this time period. Kinderman consults Karras about the church desecrations, Karras being somewhat of an expert in terms of his understanding of abnormal psychology and the religious community. In chapter 6, we're introduced to the idea that missing book is now under Regan's bed, and this is where we get detailed information about what could qualify as a possession. And it seems to be that Regan is experiencing many, if not all, of those elements. And then we're introduced to book 3, where the opening quote is about biblical signs. And again, I'll cover these quotes next class. This is where, in the first book of book 3, Chris is begging Karras for an exorcism, saying that this Regan thing is not her daughter. And this idea of the thing or the other is something that we've seen throughout the Gothic tradition. The demon, when Karras actually meets with Regan or the demon, seems to know that Karras's mother is dead, but won't reveal Karras's mother's maiden name. Whether, again, it's the idea of a supernatural entity, because after all, Satan is known as the Prince of Lies, just sort of playing around with Karras and having fun, or it's just that it's Reagan herself that somehow has either put together through pieces of overheard information that Karis's mother has died, or in one way or another has made a very clever guess, but really doesn't have any kind of real supernatural ability. And whether or not this could also be seen as poltergeist phenomenon in a way that perhaps this Reagan entity is reading Karis's thoughts or his concerns. We know that both Chris and Father Karras, whose first name is Damien, this will be important, are in pain because they're haunted by their own demons. We're told about how Chris had lost a child earlier and didn't trust the medical community, which makes it particularly difficult for her to take Reagan to the medical community. But at this point, this might be the beginning of the sign that Karras needs and wants, so his faith is beginning to return. And the demon says quite tellingly to Karras, well, we must give you some reason to doubt. Again, which leads to the possibility that ultimately the demon is playing with Karras. Karras throws supposedly holy water on the demon, and the demon responds rather violently, but it's not holy water, which is blessed by a priest. It's just merely tap water. Again, enough doubt, and perhaps that's the biggest torment at this point, at least for someone like Karras, is having doubt rather than knowing definitively if this is a real possession or this happens to be some sort of psychological phenomenon. We're introduced to Carl's daughter being a drug addict here as well. In book 2, the demon talks about that embarrassment over the holy waters. The assumption is that the demon was aware that it was tap water, unless one way or another Reagan was able to gather that information from the conversation that Karras has with Reagan's mother. We see the speaking backwards words on her skin that appear on Reagan's skin that say, "Help me." Again, this could be a physiological phenomenon, but it could also be a supernatural phenomenon. And this is where Karras asks for permission for an exorcism. There is a hierarchy in the Catholic Church, and we see his faith beginning to increase. What's interesting is that now we finally go back to Marin, which is how the novel began, and he already knows that he's going to be summoned. And again, that leads to the idea of his premonition. And our fourth and final book, where we get the opening quote, which happens to be about love and what is love. And we're introduced in book 1 of that 4th section about the significance of the name Damien. That Damien was a priest devoted to caring for lepers, and he himself caught the disease. And again, if you are at the ending of the book, and I hope you're close, if you're not already finished with the book, you can see that this is a good amount of foreshadowing of what's going to happen to Karras himself. Our climax, of course, as Hollywood takes great advantage of, is that battle of good and evil with the demon attacks. We see more of this in the text rather than in the film. But basically, we see how the demon is has a great understanding of psychology and psychological weakness. Whether that demon be, again, a true demon or the devil or happen to be a Reagan. But we know that Marin is filled with pride. There is an old literary history about pride and hubris being punished. That he's escaped his inferiors by becoming an academic, by studying archaeology, so that he doesn't necessarily have to spend time working with the poorest of the poor. Willie, of course, has the drug addict daughter. We see this with Carl Engstrom as well. Both Willie and Carl Engstrom have to suffer with that guilt and that perhaps haunting. Sharon happens to have a physical attraction to Damien Karras, so that's exploited by the demon. Again, not necessarily pursued in the film. Chris, that she's put her career before her family. Again, keep in mind this is the 1970s, so it would be somewhat unusual to have a woman in the workplace. The consequences of that, or at least from a social perspective, is that, well, Chris is now divorced, and Reagan is suffering the consequences of that. And of course, we know Karras's guilt over his mom. There are biblical references to possession, and then a very important quote on page 351 about the purpose of possession, which was not included in the original film version, but was included in the version you've never seen before, or at least as it's called, the version you've never seen before, which gives us additional footage. That the purpose of possession is not for the possessed, but for the observers, to feel despair and be confronted with the bestial, the vile, the unworthy, the ugly, the inhuman. And the question of how can that exist in a world in which there also is spiritual God. And the belief in God at this point is talked about accepting the possibility that God could love us despite the fact that there is despair and bestial and unworthiness and ugliness. And Marin talks about how he himself had once been repelled by certain people and he despaired that he couldn't love them and he lost his faith. And then came to the conclusion that what God required, and I think this is one of the messages or lessons for us, is that we're supposed to act with love. We're not necessarily supposed to feel love in our daily lives. And that this is something that's important for all of us to remember. Marin ultimately dies of a heart attack, and we know that he has a weak heart at the beginning of the novel, so that also is a little bit of foreshadowing. And where Karis and horror basically confronts the demon and demands that the demon take him. Take me, he says, which is exactly what happens, is that it would appear that the demon actually inhabits Karis's body and leaves the little girl. Or again, we could just say that this is a psychological break that occurs with Karis, though that doesn't necessarily explain why Regan would be cured unless the ceremony of exorcism itself has helped to provide her with a psychological cure, which is something that Karis suggests at one point or another. And Karis commits suicide. He jumps out of a window, and much like Jesus sacrifices himself for the sins of man. Notice that the pedestrians ignore the fact that we've got a dead body there, and they're quite indifferent to it. And I think that gets us back to the idea of that one needs to act with love. They just dismiss him, assuming that he's a drunk, and don't want to get involved. Perhaps those are the true evils in the world, whether or not there actually is demonic possession. Damien gives his last confession. Keep in mind that suicide is supposed to be a mortal sin in the Christian tradition, but the way he's described at the end is that he's peaceful with joyful eyes, the assumption that his last confession has absolved him of his sin. And then we get the epilogue, which is set in late June. Again, the idea that this is renewal and rebirth because we're going into the summertime. And Chris says she's not so sure that she believes in God, but she does believe in the devil because he keeps advertising. And that's one of the ways that you can read this book, that we may not necessarily have the literal evil of possession, but there's all kinds of human evil that exists in the world. And then Father Dyer, who happens to have been a friend of Father Karras, and Kinderman, if you'll remember this kind detective, who decides basically to close his investigation about Burke Denning's murder because there really is no definitive proof that Regan could have been involved or not. They form a friendship, and I think that's important because one of the major themes that we've seen throughout the semester in the Gothic is the importance of community, and it's something that Kinderman was lamenting, that he was rather lonely. Even though he was married, his wife would never go to the movies with him, and certainly it's something Damien Karras was lamenting, that he was rather lonely. And one could say that Chris and Regan, in part because of Chris's career, live rather lonely lives. So this idea of trying to find connection. So next class, what I wanted to do was to put some closure onto The Exorcist by reading you some passages and just generally talking about some themes. For our attendance question, which would be due Thursday, and that's the 9th of December at 8 a.m., do you think that Regan was possessed? And why or why not? Do you think Regan was possessed? And why or why not? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class by putting some closure onto The Exorcist. I can also tell you, too, you might be some of the first to know that my Shakespeare class, which was scheduled as a Monday, Wednesday from 8 to 9:15, is now going to be a online class. I don't know if that's of any interest to any of you, but if it is, you can now take my Shakespeare class in the spring semester online. Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.